Welcome to my East Lake comparison video. My goal with this video is to show the differences between the pre-renovation and post-renovation East Lake Golf Club. It took me a lot longer to do this video than I had anticipated, so I'd really appreciate a like, comment, and/or subscribe. While I built this video for Golf Plus on the Quest VR systems, Golf Plus is so accurate with the courses that it's applicable for the real-life East Lake Golf Club as well. I'm comparing the two courses using the back pin locations and the hard pins because I feel that's where you'll see the most changes. My goal is to highlight how the course changed pre and post renovation. I'm not going to talk in great detail about strategy, but there will be some discussions as I point out the changes between the two courses. Some holes may not have introduced a lot of change, while others are basically brand new holes. We'll review the holes themselves, talk about the approaches to the greens, and how the greens themselves have changed. I hope you enjoy it. So for hole 1 of East Lake, they didn't make a ton of changes, but they did make a couple of small changes that really affect a couple of shots. So if we look up here at the East Lake 2023 version, we can see from the back tees, the drive is pretty simple. The bunkers really aren't in play. The front bunkers and back bunkers are kind of away from the landing area, so it's a pretty safe landing area. Now, if you look at the newly renovated East Lake hole 1, you'll see a couple of things. They brought the one bunker on the left up a little closer, so it's definitely in play. And another big piece is, as you'll see right there on the right-hand side of the hole, you'll see this little outcropping of rough, and that is right about where your ball is going to land. So you have to be really careful with the tee shot, or else you'll get stuck in the rough with about a 200-yard uphill shot out of the rough, which can be pretty difficult. So you can see it really narrows down the landing area, and if you go too far to the left, you're going to have to contend with that bunker. Now on the approach shot, it's not much different. You still got the trees on the right to contend with. Not as much on the newer version as the older version. On East Lake 2023, if you were too far to the right, you might have to deal with the trees depending on where you go with your shot. But on the new one, they're a little more out of the way. And probably one of the biggest changes is in the green, and we'll review the green specifically here in a moment. But you can see on the approach shot, the old version had a little bit of protection around the front of the green, and they kind of continued that with the bunkers on the new renovation. So you'll see when we get to the green, a lot has changed there between the two. But for now, the approach shot is still pretty simple. You're just going to see some more undulations in the green. And you can see they've extended it a little bit. So you got about 9 more yards and a few more feet of uphill. So overall, with that little outcropping of rough on the right, the bringing up of that bunker on the left, it's a much different hole, especially from the tee. So you're going to have a little longer approach shot than usual because a little more uphill, and basically what you'll get with hole 1 is a similar feel, but it's a little straighter hole to attack in the newer version than the older version. But like I said, the biggest change is going to be on that drive. Got to be careful of that rough to the right and the sand to the left, and then the approach shot needs to be a little more calculated. So they made what I call one minor change and one major change to this green. You can see at the old East Lake, pretty much just a straight green, slopes back to front, right? Nothing too special about it. Doesn't matter where you are, you're going to have a slopey putt, right? Whether it's uphill, downhill, or left or right, no matter where they put the pin on this green. The minor change they made is, if you look at the new East Lake, you can see they kind of cut the top left part of the green off and made it fairway. So if you get into that area, instead of having a longer putt, you're going to be stuck with a chip shot. And then you can see they've got this ridge going through the new green, which really makes the green 2 different levels, right? It's almost like 2 different greens. So if the pin's on the left, you're on the bottom level. Pins on the right, you're on the top level. And if you land anywhere in that red area, it's going to fall down to the left-hand side. And if you're on pro greens, it's probably going to fall almost all the way to the pin. The one positive thing you have here with this pin is you can see that there's not a ton of slope around the hard pin flag. I know one of the positions is over on the right-hand side, which brings its own challenges into play. But basically, what they've done is they've taken this green and they've split it in two, and made the bottom left portion a little smaller. Top right portion's probably a little bigger. So that's really the major change that they made with this green. So for hole 2, being a par 3, they've added quite a bit of length to the par 3 on the hard pins. Now you may notice the length is kind of a false lengthening because the hard pin is in the back in the newer version, and in the older version the hard pin was on the front. So that kind of explains the big difference between the yardage here. Now on the old course, you'll see around the green they had some good bunker protection around the front half of the green, but pretty wide open on the back half of the green. Right, the back half of the green was pretty wide in the old version. You can see they really narrowed that down in the newer version, and the front of the green is a lot wider. You still have that bunker protection in the front, but one of the biggest things that they did in the renovation was they put that guardian bunker to the back left, and you'll also see a ridge going through the middle of the green. So when we show the green, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but being a par 3, there's not too much change, a little bit more length. Even without the pin placement moving, it's still a longer hole, as it looks like they bump that tee box a little further back. So we'll talk about the green in a little more detail, but that's the main changes for hole number 2. So hole number 2, the old East Lake, the green was a lot like the first one. You get a lot of the green that slopes from back to front, and once you're kind of on the green, unless you're stuck on the edges somewhere, there's not a whole lot going on there, right? Well, in the in the new East Lake, it's almost like you got 3, maybe even 4 sections of the green. You know, you see where the pin is at the new East Lake up at the top left. That's its own level, and even the right side can be its own level, because even if you're on the top left side, you'd have to putt across the downslopes there to be able to get to the right side of the green, perhaps. And then you have kind of the bottom left portion of the green. So this is going to be an approach on the new East Lake green that's going to be very challenging based on where the pin is, right? So they've got 3, maybe 4 really distinct areas that they could put this pin on. That's just going to make it almost a completely different hole every time you have to play in it. So we go from a little boring back to front old East Lake design to a little wider and a lot more undulation in the new green. So hole number 3 at East Lake, there was a couple of pretty big changes to this hole. One, if you look at the older version, you're going to see it's almost about 20 yards shorter, and you've got a pretty wide open landing area. You have to kind of stay away from the left side a little bit because of those trees, but the landing area is pretty wide open on the old course. On the new course, they've done something to mess with you a little bit. Kind of like a hole number 1, they've got an outcropping of rough with a sand bunker in it. So right in your landing area, it cuts that fairway in half. Now, there's not any more trees on the left-hand side, so airing to the left is not bad. It would be a shorter shot from the rough on the left-hand side, but I'd much rather head out of the rough on the left-hand side than be in that bunker on the right-hand side. So you just have to look out for that on your drive. Now the green complex, which we'll review in a little more detail here in a second, has really changed. You can see that they've still got a little bit of guardian in the front with the bunkers, not as big as the old course, but you can see they've also put some penalties for going a little long, depending on where the flag is toward the back. So that addition of that large bunker in the back is probably one of the biggest changes outside of the green itself. So on hole 3, you kind of go from a circular green to more of a square rectangle type green. Now these rectangle type greens make an appearance because it goes back to more of the original design, which is what they were trying to do with East Lake. You could look it up if you want to see kind of what the inspiration behind the new East Lake was, but it kind of takes it back to the way it was quite a while ago when it comes to the design of the course. So they wanted to go back to, I think it was like somewhere around the 1920s roots or somewhere in there, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, somewhere in there. You'd have to look it up to get more info. But you can see we've basically got a green on the old East Lake that slopes right to left, right? And then you get a little more undulation in the new green. So the greens, it's probably around the same-ish size on the new East Lake, but being square, it gives a lot more pin positions that you can put it in, and you can change the different type of putts you have. So there's a little bit of a ridge that kind of runs down the left middle part that can kind of separate the greens, especially if you're playing on pro. You land in that area, you're going to go down to the left. There's no way around it. So, whether the pin's on the left or the pin's on the right, you kind of get a different green experience. But at least it looks like at a lot of places on the new East Lake green, it's not quite as sloped, except right there in the middle, as the old green. So I like the design of the third green. It's actually, I think it's done pretty well. So gives you a nice open green to hit at. So this is one of those holes where I'd say it's pretty easy to fire right at this pin. For hole number 4, it's another pretty big mess of changes on this hole. So on the older version, it was a tiny bit of a dog leg to the left, and you can see up here on the old version, they really only protected the left side of the fairway with those 2 bunkers. And on the new version, they still have some protection on the left-hand side with 1 bunker. But for your really big hitters, they've got that bunker on the right that could potentially come into play if you hit it far enough, if you got some wind behind you. So that bunker can be in play in certain conditions. So again, like some of the other holes, we'll see that the landing area has been narrowed a lot off the tee. So it's not quite of an easy shot off the tee as it was on the old version. Another big change, you can see the shape of the green is completely changed, and we'll review that in a second. But you can see in the old version, they pretty much just had that front left part of the green protected by a bunker, and now they've got bunkers pretty much completely surrounding this green. So no matter where they put the pin, unless it's dead in the middle of the green, a slight miss could put you in a bunker. So you got to be really careful about that with your second shot. Now the one positive thing is it's not quite as much elevation, and the green is, depending on where the pin is, has been shortened anywhere from about 15 to close to 25 yards, depending on where you are. So the second shot on the new East Lake could be a little bit more manageable, but they certainly made up for that by putting all the bunkers around the greens. So hole 4 is another one of those greens where they went from a more circular type green to a rectangular shaped green. So you can see you got big slope from back to front, little left to rightish, but mainly back to front on the old East Lake green. And you can see a bunch of different undulations and directions depending on where the pin is on the new East Lake green. So, it's very well protected on the left and the right side by bunkers. But depending on where the pin is, it could be a pretty easy shot into the new East Lake green. So one of the good things you got going for you is in a lot of the area it does slope from back to front, so it gives you the ability to take it in pin high or a little more than pin high and spin it back and get pretty close to this pin. All right, for hole 5, we've got a little bit of change, not too much. It's still going to be a downhill par 4. All right. Now, in the old East Lake, it was a straight shot. There were no bunkers in the fairway. There were some bunkers protecting the greens in the front, but not a whole lot of challenge to this hole. On the new one, they have added that little bunker on the left-hand side, which narrows that landing area a little bit, especially depending on which way the wind is blowing. So that unless the wind's heavy into your face, that bunker's going to be in play on your tee shot. And you can see it kind of stretches about 20, 30 yards there, so that's going to be something you want to look at when you're hitting your drive. As far as the approach goes, not a huge change in the angle of the green. You can see in the old one it had some front right and front left protection with the bunkers, and now it's just got that front left protection. But depending on where they put the flag, that's a big deal. They got a little protection over the back of it as well, but overall the green's about the same amount of challenge to hit um, in the new version of Eastlake as it was in the old. So hole five between the two East Lakes, there's not a ton of difference. You see very similar undulations and slopes in this green. I wouldn't say there's a whole lot of change here. Obviously, I think they widened it a little bit, maybe because you can see you got a pin placement on the new East Lake that would not really be very possible on the old East Lake green. It's at least not as extreme as it is down there on the new one. So a little bit of a wider green, probably shortened it up a tiny, tiny bit, except right in the middle, um, from front to back. But overall, this is pretty close to what it used to be. So for hole six, you can see that they added a little bit of uphill, probably not much to make a difference, and they shortened up the hole a little bit. So it's kind of a shorter par five. There's not much difference on the drive. In the old version and the new version, you've got both protection on the right and protection on the left. The good news in the new version is you can see that bunker on the left is a little further back. So unless you've got some big wind in your face or you're a big hitter, it may not be in play on most shots, giving you a little bit more area to land the ball without having to take a shorter club and having a longer second shot like you sometimes had to do on the old version of East Lake. The biggest change here is going to be that green complex. In the old version, it had some protection to the left. It had some protection on the front right, but for the most part, the green was pretty approachable. On the new version, they pretty much almost surround the entire green. So unless the pin's on the far right hand side of the green, it's going to be a lot more challenging to get your ball to land on the green and hold and have a decent shot at eagle. I'd say they probably reduced your chance of eagle on this hole, even though they shortened the hole probably by about 50% by the way they protected this green. So you can see on hole six here, they've kind of flipped the green. On the old East Lake, it was, running from top right up there down to bottom left, and now we've got more of a top left to bottom right type design. So they kind of almost did a 180 flip, like flipped it upside down. But outside of that, if you take that into consideration, it's not that big of a change on this green. You can see some similar undulations. It's a little tighter up in the top right, a little more downhill from top to bottom as it is in the new one. But as you can see, no matter where you are on this green, it's going to be a break and putt for you. So take the old green, take it and just flip it over on a table, and that's basically what you get between these two greens. So I like this design because based on the way you come into the approach, that's a more gettable green in my opinion. Um, Especially works well for right-handed folks who like to draw the ball. So that's going to be your difference between the old and new East Lake on hole six. For hole seven, one of the things that you'll notice is on the old version, you pretty much just had to kind of shy away from the left side, but you still had a pretty big landing area, and you get a little bit of wind behind you. You can even take all of those bunkers on the left-hand side out of play. On the new version, they change it up a little bit. They stick that bunker on the left. There's only one now, but they stick it out a little further, kind of narrowing your landing area. And then one thing you have to be careful of on the new version that you didn't on the old version was if you hit the ball a little long or you get some good wind behind you, that bunker on the right does come into play. I've been in that bunker a couple of times myself, so depending on your conditions, you may have to take a little strategy shot here. Maybe if you got the right conditions, you can clear that left bunker. But still, if you do that, you got a narrow landing area. And same if you don't think you can reach that bunker on the right, your landing area is still going to be a little narrow because of how that bunker pops out from the left side. Now, one of the better changes I think they did, or at least in the positive, was they made this green complex a little bigger. In the old version, they had some protection around the front half part of the green, and they kind of continued that a little bit, although they got rid of that front left bunker, so there's some middle protection and then just some front right protection. But the green's a little wider all the way through, I think, and depending on where they put the pin, again, if you can avoid those two bunkers in the fairway, this is a very approachable green, and definitely a birdie hole. They did lengthen your second shot a little bit. You can see you got close to 20 yards longer on the approach shot than you do on the new one than you did on the old one. So it makes it a club or two more, but they kind of compensated that by making the green complex a little more approachable and easier to hit. So when it comes to hole 7 in the green complex, there's not a lot of change here. They did square it off a little more, going with the whole theme of the square greens on a lot of these holes. But from an overall perspective, you still got the protection right, protection left. The green, I think, may be a tiny bit wider, but for the most part, there's not a lot of change here on this green. Okay, so hole 8 has actually had some pretty major changes here. The first being off the drive, you pretty much only had to worry about those bunkers to the right, which were even right of the fairway. But you can see in the new version, they've put a bunker here on the left, right in about your landing area. So if you can't carry that, it can be a little difficult, right? They've also severely shortened up the hole. So here's what that's going to do. Let's take a look at the old East Lake. Let's say you hit a drive down the middle of the fairway. You're going to have a full club into this green, which is a good thing, right? So let's look on the new East Lake. If you hit your driver, let's say you clear that bunker on the left and roll a little bit, you could wind up with like a 50, 60 yard approach shot, which is going to be kind of an in between number, especially in Golf Plus, right? You hit a little too far on the right hand side, you might get into that bunker if you've got some wind behind you. So you've got a really narrow landing area. Your only chance for a full shot into the screen is to stay short of that right hand bunker and avoid that left hand bunker. And depending on the conditions, that can be really hard to do. So this may be a good hole for a 3 wood or maybe even 5 wood to give yourself a nice full shot into the green. It really all depends on what you prefer. Now another big change, you'll see in the old version of East Lake, they had this huge bunker protecting the front of the green, which makes the hard pin really hard to get close to. Now, the good news is on the new version, they've gotten rid of pretty much that entire bunker. They have a little protection front right and some long, but basically it's wide open in the front, right? So unless the pin is severely tucked up in the upper right hand side of that green, it's going to be a pretty wide open green to take a shot at. So in my opinion, I think if you don't feel like messing with those bunkers, I think a layup that winds up short of those bunkers, especially that one on the left, is still going to give you a wedge, maybe pitching wedge, maybe 9 iron at the worst into this green. So that might be a good strategy on the new version of East Lake. So overall, I think the newer version of East Lake is easier. But with a driver in your hand, I think it could potentially be harder. Whereas on the old version, you could just take a swing, hit it down the fairway, and then hit your approach. Now you have to be really careful of what you do off the tee on the new version, whereas you didn't really have to on the old version. So on hole 8, you've got a little bit of change. Um, it's not much. The overall shape of the green hadn't changed. It looks to be a little tiny bit wider, a little bigger surface on the new East Lake, but overall there's not a lot of change. Little less undulation, I think, on the new green than there was on the old green, but for the most part it's a pretty similar design. It just looks like they added some square footage for you to hit. So hole 9 is one of those holes that didn't see too much of a change. It's still a very, very long par 3. It's pretty flat. The green complex did change quite a bit, but they still kept some protection in the front of that green. But there's no protection on the front right really anymore. So depending on where the pin is, it could be a pretty easy hole uh, to get to if you've got the right club. So we'll talk about the green complex in a minute. But overall, being a par 3, the only really big change there is the expansion of that lake, right? So before, especially in the VR golf game, Golf Plus, the water was never in play unless something really, really bad happened on the old course. But it can be in play a little bit on the new version. If you hit it short on the old version, you had 30, 40, 50 yards of rough to play with that you could hit up to. You hit it too short trying to get too cute with a shot, and you could be in the water. So that's one thing to look out for is the water is a lot closer to the green now than it was in the past. But overall, little change in the green complex, similar protections around the green. Not too much change. It's just now you no longer have the option to come up short and get away with it. So hole 9, it basically looks like you're looking at two different greens, right? So on the old East Lake, you have this big back to front sloping, almost teardrop, upside down teardrop shaped green, whereas on the new East Lake you got this almost kidney shaped green. So instead of it being somewhat wide and going from top down to bottom that way, which allowed you to, especially when the pin's in the back, allowed you to hit the green in a much shorter position and potentially roll up to the hole. You got to have a lot more control um, on the new green because you can see back to front, it's probably somewhere between a third and a half of the green to work with back to front. So depending on where they put this pin, you've got some fairway in front of the green to work it up there, but you got nowhere near as much green surface on this one. So they shrunk it down and basically took the old green and squished it between their two fingers. It's kind of what it seems like. So two completely different green complexes between the old and the new on number 9. So hole 10 is probably one of the least changed holes, in my opinion. The angle on the approach is slightly different, but you can see you got a wide open shot down the middle of the fairway. The fairway is a little tighter in the landing area on the new East Lake versus the old, but there's still no real danger around it, right? And they even removed all those trees on the right hand side. So a shot in the right hand rough is no longer penal. And even a shot on the left hand side, probably but just as penal in both versions. But if you have to err to one side, you err to the right. And if you do happen to hit into the rough, it's going to be a short. It's going to be a wedge, some type of wedge in your hand, even from the rough on the right hand side. So there's not much difference in the drive other than that, just a slightly smaller, narrow landing area. Now the green hasn't changed too much. There's still some protections. In the older East Lake, the protections extended toward the back middle of the green on either side. Now they've kind of shifted all the protection of the green to the front. So, unless you come up short with your ball, you're probably not going to have to worry about these bunkers. So overall, even despite the more narrow landing area, I think the hole is a little bit easier now because you don't have to worry about being too far right or too far left unless that pin is tucked up in the front. It should be a little easier on the new version versus the old. So on hole number 10, the big change that they made, you can see on the old East Lake, it's really two different levels, so two different greens really, depending on where they put the pin. You still have a little bit of barrier in the middle on the left hand side of the new East Lake, but you can see for the most part they've taken out that barrier. On the old East Lake, your ball's gonna, if you're in that red, your ball's gonna come back down. Um, but on the new East Lake, you could be in that same type of area and have your ball stay and not come all the way back down. So I feel like they've made this green a little easier to hit and hold. You can see, especially with the hard pin here, everything kind of flows toward the pin, and directly below the pin, while they did cut off a little bit of the green in the front, especially the front right, it's a pretty similar shape. They just took out that ridge, or most of the ridge in the middle on the new East Lake. For hole 11, there both is and isn't a lot of change on this hole. It's very subtle. The green complex has a little bit of change, and we'll talk about that when we get to the greens. But you still got that front right protection on the green complex, and you still got that protection to the left. It's a little more in the front on the newer version, and a little less on the left side in the newer version. But there's still some danger there. So standing on the tee box, you've got about 20 more yards, a little less downhill, so it definitely plays all of 20 yards longer on this shot. And you still got to worry about the front right, and you still got to worry about the left side of the green. But outside of that, there's not a whole lot of change in this hole. So hole 11 is another one where they look like two completely different greens. You can see a lot of protection here on the left hand side. You can see mainly a back to front type sloping green with a little side to side when you get down to the bottom. And then you have a completely different complex. A little bit of a ridge in the front part guarding that back pin location. So if you land short and you're trying to run it up there, it's probably not going to get up there very easily. It's probably going to come back down on you. So they got a little bit of a guardian there on the new East Lake green. But again, like I said, it looks like two completely different greens. So they obviously scrapped what they had before and just went to a whole new design. For hole 12, they shortened it up a little bit for you. In the old version, you did have that bunker on the right and a little bunker on the left to worry about with your drive. Now the landing area is a little smaller in the newer version, as you can see that bunker pops out. But unless you got a lot of wind in your face, it's likely that you may be able to carry that piece. But it does make that landing area a little shorter in the newer version. Some big changes on the green. We'll talk about that. You just got a little bit of front left protection, a little bit of back right protection. So completely different bunker complex around the green than you saw in the old East Lake, which I think makes this green a lot more approachable. And you can even see on the new version that the hard pin here is not as close to the bunkers as it was on the old. So this is being a short hole. If you want a full club in, you might even want to consider being short of that bunker, and you'd still have a wedge in your hand, maybe with like a 3-wood. But it's a short hole, very scoreable hole, and overall I think a lot easier than the older version. So hole 12 is yet another pretty significant redesign. You can see a lot more undulation, a lot more slope back to front on the old East Lake than you have on the new East Lake. So instead of the kind of the showcase of the old East Lake green being the top right up there, I think they kind of like that top left to be more of a showcase. And you can see on the hard pin, instead of sticking it all the way in the back, they put it more towards the front right, where you have a lot of you have some false front here to deal with if you can't take it all the way to the hole. They also got rid of a lot of the protection on the right-hand side of the green between the old and the new. So I would say this is probably a little easier green to hit to. I would think, because it doesn't slope quite as severely. But I like the new green over the old one. I think it's more in line with what they were hoping East Lake would be than the old one was. Hole 13 is one of those holes that saw kind of what I call a flip and change, right? So what I mean by that is if you look at the old version, you had the bunkers up the right hand side that you had to worry about. So you'd had to err a little bit to the left. On the newer version, you can see they've moved those bunkers to the left hand side and pushed them out into the fairway a little more than the ones on the right in the old East Lake were. So now you've got a much smaller landing area in the newer version than you did in the older version, right? And then your approach into the green, they've kind of made the green a little wider. They've more squared it out, so I think it's a lot easier to approach. You still have that protection in the front left. You still got some bunkers on the right, but the big addition is those two bunkers that stretch up the right really protect the right hand side of the hole. So unless the pin's on the right hand side of the hole, I think this is a very scoreable hole on the new East Lake. The old East Lake was also a very scoreable hole because you can see as long as the pin wasn't tucked up in the very front, you didn't have a whole lot of danger around the hole. So big thing to watch out for is now you're airing down the right side of the fairway versus the left side of the fairway in the old version. And when you're coming into the green, really all you have to worry about is those bunkers on the right versus the mainly all the protection on the old version being in the front. So when it comes to hole 13, there's not a lot of change in the shape of the green. You can see in the old East Lake it was more of an oval, and again they've kind of more squared it or rectangled it off a little bit, and keeping with that theme. So in the old one, you can see there was some pretty tight breaks, pretty heavy undulation in the green, especially from back to front, and a lot of that's kind of been taken out for the most part of this green. So I think it makes it a little bit more of an approachable green, no matter where they have the pin. So this is one of those ones that on the new East Lake is easy to fire, directly at the pin, a little more easier than the old East Lake one was. So hole 14 isn't a lot different. The landing area is about the same. From an overall perspective, they narrowed the fairway a little bit on 14. Right? They've extended it about 15 yards or so. Uh, but the hole's going to play pretty much the same, except for the shot into the green. So, your drive's going to be pretty much the same on both courses. You're going to have to hit it down into a tight landing area. But on your second shot, you can see that the green is a little less protected in the early front on the old than versus the new. It's still pretty similar. They both have a little bit of right protection, although they brought that right side protection much longer along the full right side of the green in the new version, so it can be a little tight if you're trying to hit it a pin that's kind of tucked to the right. They also have those couple of bunkers short right, which could really mess with an approach shot if you're trying to run one up onto the green. In the older version, you can see it was a little more open, so you could hit a runner, you could hit it in front of the green, and you could run it up. You can still kind of do that on the new East Lake, but you got to be real careful with that bunker that sticks out. So if you've got a long shot and you're just trying to run it, you might have to contend with that bunker. So that just adds another element to this par five. But overall, the approach on this hole from tee to green is still pretty similar. They just rearranged the bunkers a little bit, a little more forgiving on the front left side in the new East Lake versus the old. But if you're on with your game, this hole's going to play basically the same in the old version and the new version. So when it comes to hole 14, there's not a lot of change here in my opinion. Again, a little more squared off versus rounded edges of the green. But overall, it's pretty similar, right? The hard pins are in very similar spots. In the new East Lake, they did add a little more protection on the right-hand side of this green with a bunker, but when it comes to changes on this green, there's not a whole lot of changes. They took out a lot of the undulation so it makes it I think a little bit easier to work around this green and make some putts. All right, so hole 15. This hole is a beast, no matter how you look at it. It may not look at it if you're looking at the stats on the right hand side, but it has been lengthened a little bit. So you can see the pin is 218 yards with the pin in the back on the old version, but it's 217 yards with the pin on the front. So they did lengthen this a little bit from the back tees. Now the biggest change that I see on this hole is that bunker on the left-hand side of the green. They removed that in the new version. So that could be a bad thing. Balls don't tend to roll into the water if they go on the left-hand side and hit that bunker. You go on the left-hand side and miss the green on the new East Lake, you're likely in the water. So they lengthen the green a tiny bit from back to front, although they do narrow it off in the back, whereas they didn't really do that in the old East Lake too much. But still, it's a 220-yard shot from the tee to basically an island green. There's less on the back end to go with. It was wider in the older version, as you can see. It even had a little backstop there with the grandstand, but that's gone on the new East Lake course. So you have to be. I would say the biggest change is you have to be a little more accurate, a little more calculated with your shot on the new East Lake, because you've got about a 25% higher chance with that removal of the bunker and the narrowing of the back of it, if you happen to go long, of being in the water, whereas on the old version of East Lake, that same shot may not be in the water. So hole 15, I think kind of the major change that they made here to this green is it's not quite as long back to front, and you got a little less room for error. So you can see on the old East Lake, you can see the rough off the side of the green to the right is about twice as much of an area, and even on the left-hand side, it's probably 3 times as much of an area with a bunker to stop your ball. On the new East Lake, if you land, depending on where you land in this rough, on either the right or the left side, you're probably going to go into the water. So basically what they've done is, on an already long hole, they've made the green even tougher, I think, in the new East Lake. If you can manage to kind of stay on the green, I think it might be a little easier from the putting perspective. But you've got no room for error. You've got to hit this green. If you don't hit this green, there's a high chance that you're in the water, right? And you can't see it on this one, but you saw it in the previous mention of the hole. But they've also really thinned up what's back and over the back of the green. So, over the green type shots on old East Lake that would have stayed won't stay on the new East Lake. So they've basically taken this green, shrunk down all the edges around it, so it makes it even more important to hit this green on the new East Lake than it was on the old. So hole 16 is one that, again, doesn't see a lot of change. You've got that bunker complex down the right-hand side. You've got the bunker down the left-hand side. The landing area, if you have to worry about that bunker on the left, is a little more narrow than it was on the old version, but you still got that threat on the right and left side. The one positive thing is usually the right and the left bunkers aren't both in play. Either you have to worry about the bunkers on the right or the bunkers on the left, depending on the wind. So there could be a rare condition where I guess they could both come into play, but usually that's not the case. And then on your approach shot, you still are going to see the protection in the front left. They added a little protection in the front right, but overall your approach shot is going to look pretty similar in both versions of the East Lake. So this is another hole where you'd think you were looking at two completely different green complexes, right? They got the old East Lake green almost looks kind of like it's shaped like the continent of Africa, and then it's just a completely different shape uh, on the new East Lake. So, you kind of had three distinct areas of the green in the old East Lake, and you don't really get that very much in the new East Lake. So, again, I think they just bulldozed this entire green and just said, let's just start over from scratch. Right. About the only thing that's similar between the two holes is the bunker protection that they have on the left hand side here. Outside of that, it's just a completely new green complex. Maybe one other similarity is the back to front slope, but you see that on a lot of greens at East Lake anyway. Um, so that's the difference in hole 16's green. So hole 17 is probably the one that shows the biggest amount of change, although it may not play too much differently because I think the strategy is still pretty similar. You got to avoid the bunkers on the left hand side. Um, the one thing you could have going for you is if you have a lot of wind behind you, there's now an area to the left of those bunkers to where you can stay left of those bunkers and get into the fairway, although that could potentially give you an awkward yardage depending on how far it goes. But most of the time, your shots are going to be down the right hand side. So instead of being able to hit the fairway and maybe hit a draw, run to the left, get past those bunkers on the left, now those bunkers extend all the way down there. So from an aesthetic perspective, it looks like a completely different hole. Now, when you get to your approach shot and the green complex, it's very different, right? They had a lot of protection up front, and it's almost like they took the green and tilted it to the left 90 degrees in the way they shaped it, and moved that protection on the front of the green to the left-hand side of the green, which goes all the way back. They do have some protection on the front right, but now you've got green length protection on the left-hand side with the new East Lake, whereas you had green length protection in the front with the old East Lake. So, for all intents and purposes, based on the way you have to play the hole, it's a pretty different hole. But you're still driving to the right-hand side. Your approach shot's just going to be a lot different. Now you're going to potentially have a little more green to work with in the front part of it, whereas with it not being quite as long front to back in the old version, you had to be a little more calculated with your shot. You get a little bit more room for error on the new version of the East Lake on your approach shot. So hole 17 is an interesting one because I can see the similarities, um, but with what they did, especially with this back left hole location, you can see that they both still have protection to the left, but on the new East Lake, you can see down here on the left-hand side of the new East Lake that that bunker protection runs the whole length of the green, and the angle at which you come at makes this a pretty straight on green. So you kind of got that upper echelon where if you don't get it all the way up there, it's probably going to come down a little bit. And then on the old East Lake green, it was more split in the middle. So you can see this little ridge on the old East Lake on top, that little red ridge where if you don't get it all the way up there, that red ridge will probably bring that ball back down to the other level of the green. And you don't really get that as much, at least not to that level on the new East Lake green. So they basically took a top left to bottom right design and made it a straight up, almost rectangular type design like they like to do at East Lake on the new one, and then they have that border all the way on the left hand side with the bunker. So it's definitely an interesting green to hit into if you can get your shot in the fairway. So hole 18, as far as the strategy to the hole, I don't think there's a whole lot that changes off the tee. It's still going to be downhill. If you got a lot of wind behind you, you still could potentially have to worry about the water. But as you can see, they've kind of taken the water and made it a little more affecting of your second shot, depending on where you hit your drive. So you can see the lake doesn't go near as far to the right-hand side as it did in the old version of East Lake, but yet it extends a lot further than it used to. So you got a little more water that stays in play for this hole. But for the most part, you're still hitting your drive off the tee box. And what it also does is from the shorter tees, it really narrows your landing area. If you're on say the front tees, and you can, normally you could easily carry the water on on the old version of East Lake. Now, because that water extends, you have no reprieve to the right, right? No matter where the tee is, if you go too far, you're going to be in the water. If you go too far to the right, that is. So, but from the back tees, you're hitting it down the fairway. Now, your approach shot is completely different. On the old version of East Lake, unless you have that hard pin tucked with all the bunker protection they have on the right, it was a pretty wide open green to get into. So even there, you could hit the ball, land short of the green, and you could roll up. Now in the new version of East Lake, they've got a whole smattering of bunkers protecting most of the front to the front left side of this green. So if you want to take advantage of being able to bounce it up onto the green, that's only going to be helpful if the pin's on the far right hand side. But if the pin's in the position it is, you see here, the hard pin, you've got all of those bunkers that are there to protect. So if you fly those bunkers, unless you come in with a really high shot or a lot of spin, it's going to be nearly impossible to stop that ball on the green with your second shot. You still have the same kind of danger with the bunker on the front left if you want to do a layup, but keep in mind the layup shot, you had a lot more room in the old East Lake. Some of that area that you had to lay up, especially if you still wanted to have a full shot into the green, has now been erased mostly by that water. So the aim of the hole is still the same. Hit your drive, stay short of the water, and then you have an approach shot into the green. But as you can see, the green complex looks a lot different. We'll review that in more detail here in a second. But the biggest change in this hole is definitely going to be the ability for a layup and your approach shot into the green. All right, and here we are at the finishing hole, hole 18. So this is another one that is just you'd swear you were looking at two different greens. So you can see in the old East Lake, it's more of your modern day green that you see. It's surrounded by bunkers, and they can put the pin in a lot of different places. But it's kind of one main level green. And what they've done here at the new East Lake is they have split this off into two separate greens. So you can see that ridge that runs through the middle left of the green. If you're not up there on that level, that ridge is going to take the ball 10, 15 feet at least down to the right side of the green, leaving you a tough putt if you have the pin placement on the left there, like you see it in this video. So it's almost another one done from scratch. The other big point, you can't see it too well in these videos, but the green's kind of open to get to on the bottom left of the old East Lake up at the top, and the only opening to this green is going to be on the far bottom right of this green. So otherwise you're going to have to deal with all those bunkers that are in front of the left to middle of the green on the new East Lake. So it's been completely redone and is a whole different challenge from the old East Lake.